The sound of flesh meeting flesh echoed through Thornfield Boxing Gym like a gunshot. Crispin Ashworth, 16 years old and weighing barely 55 kilograms, hit the concrete floor with a sickening thud. Blood trickled from his split lip, mixing with the sweat and tears that he had been holding back for weeks. Standing over him, breathing heavily with adrenaline and misplaced rage, was Lysander Pembroke, 18 years old and nearly twice Crispin's size. Lysander's expensive Nike trainers were planted firmly on either side of Crispin's prone form, and in his right hand he held his smartphone, the recording light blinking red. "That's for what you people did to my city," Lysander snarled, his voice carrying the kind of venom that comes from deep, unprocessed pain. "Refugees like you bring nothing but death and destruction. You're all the same, murderers and terrorists pretending to be victims." The words cut deeper than any physical blow could have. Crispin lay on the cold floor of the Wythenshawe Community Gym, tasting copper in his mouth and feeling the familiar ache of injustice settle in his chest. For 6 months, ever since he and his 8-year-old brother Peregrine had arrived in Manchester, he had endured the stares, the whispers, the casual cruelty of people who saw only what they wanted to see when they looked at him. "My mother wasn't a murderer," Crispin whispered, his voice barely audible above the gym's ambient noise of punching bags and training equipment. The words came out thick through his swollen lip, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. Lysander's response was to raise his foot, preparing to deliver a kick to Crispin's ribs. The sight of this bigger, stronger young man about to assault someone already on the ground was too much for the handful of other gym users, but none of them moved to intervene. This wasn't their fight, they told themselves. Better to stay out of it. But then the gym's front door exploded open with such force that it slammed against the wall, sending a reverberating crash through the building. The sound was so sudden and violent that everyone in the facility froze, including Lysander, whose foot remained suspended in mid-air. Tyson Fury filled the doorway like an avenging angel, his 6'9" frame silhouetted against the grey Manchester afternoon. His face was a mask of barely controlled fury, his eyes scanning the scene with the predatory focus of a man who had spent his life reading violence and understanding its implications. "Get your foot away from that boy right now." The command came out of Tyson's mouth with such authority that Lysander immediately stumbled backward, his phone clattering to the floor. Tyson strode across the gym floor with the measured pace of someone who knew that his presence alone could diffuse most situations, but whose patience was hanging by a thread. He had come to the gym for his daily workout, part of maintaining the fitness regimen that had made him a champion. What he found instead was a scene that transported him back to his own teenage years, when bigger kids had targeted him for being different, for being from a traveling family, for not fitting into their narrow definitions of acceptable. Kneeling beside Crispin with surprising gentleness for such a large man, Tyson placed one massive hand on the teenager's shoulder. "Easy there, son. Let me help you up." As Crispin struggled to sit up, Tyson got his first clear look at the boy's face. What he saw there, the mixture of pain, resignation, and stubborn dignity, reminded him powerfully of looking in the mirror during the worst periods of his own life. This wasn't just a kid who had been beaten up. This was someone who had been systematically ground down by circumstances beyond his control. "What's your name?" Tyson asked softly, using his own shirt sleeve to dab at the blood on Crispin's lip. "Crispin," the boy replied, still struggling to process that Tyson Fury, was kneeling beside him in a Wythenshawe Community Gym. "Crispin Ashworth." "Well, Crispin Ashworth, I'm Tyson, and I want you to know that what just happened here is not okay. Not in my city, not anywhere." Crispin's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with physical pain. For months, he had been invisible to most people, or worse than invisible, seen only as a problem to be solved or a threat to be managed. Having someone speak to him with basic human dignity felt like a revelation. "How old are you, son?" Tyson continued, helping Crispin to his feet with careful attention to any signs of serious injury. 16, Crispin replied, swaying slightly as he found his balance. "And where are you from originally?" "Syria," Crispin said quietly, bracing himself for the reaction that usually followed this admission. But Tyson simply nodded. "Long journey to get here, I imagine. You and your family." Crispin's composure finally cracked. "My mother, she died getting us here. She protected me and my little brother until the very end. She was the bravest person I ever knew." The simple words hit Tyson like a physical blow. Here was a 16-year-old boy who had watched his mother die, who had somehow managed to get himself and a younger sibling to safety across thousands of miles, and he was being called a terrorist by privileged kids who had never known real hardship. Without saying a word, Tyson reached into his gym bag and pulled out his training gloves. the same red leather Everlast gloves he had worn during sparring sessions that prepared him for some of his biggest victories. They were sacred to him, imbued with memories of triumph and struggle, signed by his trainer and blessed by his father. He placed them in Crispin's hands. "Your mother was a warrior," Tyson said, his voice thick with emotion. "She fought to protect her children against impossible odds. That makes you the son of a warrior, and warriors don't give up." Crispin stared down at the gloves in his hands, feeling their weight and understanding instinctively that he was being given something far more valuable than mere equipment. These gloves represented hope, belief, the possibility that someone saw potential in him rather than just problems. "Mr. Fury," he whispered, "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything yet," Tyson replied, standing to his full height. "Show me. Show the world. Show yourself what the son of a warrior can become." For a moment, it seemed like the story might have a happy ending right there. Crispin clutched the gloves to his chest, feeling something he hadn't experienced in months, the sense that he might have found an ally, a mentor, someone who believed in him. But then Barnaby Thornfield emerged from his office at the back of the gym. Barnaby was 52 years old, had owned the gym for 15 years, and had built his reputation on being tough but fair with the local kids who came to train. But the sight of a refugee boy being given special attention by Manchester's most famous athlete triggered something ugly in his worldview. "Right then," Barnaby announced loudly enough for everyone in the gym to hear. "I think we've had enough drama for one day." He pointed directly at Crispin. "You, boy. I want you and your little brother out of this neighborhood by tomorrow morning. I've been patient long enough with your kind hanging around here, but this has gone too far." The harshness of his words sent a shocked silence through the gym. Even Lysander, who had started the confrontation, looked uncomfortable with this escalation. "And if I see either of you around here again," Barnaby continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive, "it won't be just a punch in the face you'll be dealing with. This is a respectable community, and we don't need troublemakers stirring things up." Tyson turned to face Barnaby with an expression that made the gym owner take an involuntary step backward. "Barnaby, I think you might want to reconsider what you just said." "With respect, Mr. Fury," Barnaby replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "This is my establishment, and I decide who's welcome here. That boy has been nothing but trouble since he arrived." "What kind of trouble?" Tyson asked quietly. Barnaby struggled to come up with specifics. "Well, there's always problems when people like him are around. Everyone knows that." The silence that followed was deafening. Tyson looked around the gym at the other users, most of whom were avoiding eye contact, ashamed of what they were witnessing but unwilling to take a stand. "So let me understand this," Tyson said to Barnaby. "A boy who's lost his mother, who's caring for his younger brother, who comes here to train quietly without bothering anyone. This boy is trouble? But the kid who was just filming himself beating up someone half his size, that's acceptable behavior?" Barnaby's face reddened, but he held his ground. "That's different. Lysander's family has been part of this community for generations. They belong here." The word belong hung in the air like a poison cloud. Crispin felt the gloves in his hands grow heavy, not with potential now, but with the weight of doors closing, opportunities vanishing, hope being systematically extinguished. "I understand," Crispin said quietly, his voice carrying a dignity that was heartbreaking in its maturity. He looked down at the gloves Tyson had given him, then up at the man who had shown him such unexpected kindness. "Thank you for what you did, Mr. Fury. I'll never forget it." As Crispin walked toward the gym's exit, still clutching the boxing gloves, Tyson felt a familiar rage building in his chest. But this wasn't the hot anger of the boxing ring. This was the cold fury that came from watching injustice triumph over decency, from seeing a child's hope being crushed by adult prejudice. "This isn't over," he called after Crispin. The boy paused at the doorway and looked back. "Yes, it is," he said sadly. "It was over before it started." And with that, Crispin Ashworth walked out into the grey Manchester afternoon, carrying with him Tyson Fury's boxing gloves and the crushing weight of knowing that even champions couldn't always protect people from the cruelty of the world. The rain had started falling around midnight, turning the streets of Wythenshawe into rivers of reflected streetlight and despair. Crispin sat on a bench outside the closed community centre, Tyson's boxing gloves clutched in his lap, watching the water run off the brim of his thin jacket's hood. He had been sitting there for 3 hours, unable to bring himself to return to the temporary accommodation where his little brother was sleeping. The hostel where they had been placed was a grim building that smelled of disinfectant and hopelessness. 23 families crowded into spaces meant for 12, sharing bathrooms and kitchens. living day to day on the charity of a system that seemed designed to remind them of their precarious status at every turn. Crispin had grown used to the conditions, but tonight the thought of returning to that cramped room felt impossible. The gloves in his hands were soaked through now, the red leather darkened to burgundy by the relentless Manchester rain. He ran his fingers over the worn surfaces, imagining the victories they had witnessed, the dreams they had helped fulfill. For a few precious minutes in that gym, holding these gloves, he had felt like he might be capable of something more than mere survival. Now they felt like artifacts from someone else's life. A police car rolled slowly past the community center, its occupants giving Crispin the kind of long, assessing look that had become familiar over the past 6 months. He knew they were debating whether to stop, whether a 16-year-old sitting alone in the rain at 3 a.m. constituted enough of a problem to require intervention. After a moment's hesitation, they drove on, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the steady rhythm of raindrops hitting the pavement. Crispin closed his eyes and tried to remember his mother's face. Amira Ashworth had been 34 when she died, still young enough to have dreams of her own, but old enough to understand that her children's futures mattered more than her present comfort. She had spoken 5 languages fluently, held a university degree in literature, and had once taught poetry to students who respected her intellect and creativity. That version of his mother seemed like a character from someone else's story now. The woman Crispin remembered most clearly was the one who had spent their final weeks together, moving from one temporary shelter to another, using her body to shield him and Peregrine from checkpoint guards, relief workers, and the countless other adults who had the power to separate their family with a single decision. She had died on a boat in the Mediterranean, 30 kilometers from the Italian coast. A sudden storm had overwhelmed the overloaded vessel, and in the chaos that followed, Amira had pushed her sons toward a rescue worker's hands while disappearing beneath the black water herself. The last thing she had said to Crispin was, "Take care of your brother. Promise me." He had kept that promise for 18 months now, through refugee camps, bureaucratic labyrinths, and the soul-crushing process of starting over in a country that seemed determined to remind them that they were not wanted. But tonight, sitting in the rain outside a locked building in a city where they had no friends and few allies, Crispin wondered if he was strong enough to keep his word. The sound of his phone buzzing pulled him back to the present. A text message from Ophelia Grimsby, the social worker assigned to their case. "Peregrine has a fever. Need you back here." Crispin's heart rate spiked as he read the message. His brother had been fighting off a persistent cough for weeks, the kind of respiratory infection that thrived in overcrowded conditions with poor ventilation. The hostel's nurse had given them some basic medication, but Peregrine's 8-year-old immune system had been compromised by the stress and malnutrition of their journey. He ran the 15 blocks back to the hostel, his feet splashing through puddles and his mind racing through worst-case scenarios. When he arrived, breathless and soaked to the skin, he found Ophelia waiting in the lobby with a thermometer and a look of professional concern that did nothing to calm his nerves. "He's been asking for you," she said without preamble. "Temperature's been climbing for the past 2 hours. We need to get him to hospital if it goes much higher." Crispin took the stairs 3 at a time, arriving at their shared room to find Peregrine lying in the narrow bed they shared, his small body racked with shivers, despite being covered by every blanket they owned. His usually bright eyes were glassy with fever, and when he saw Crispin, he tried to sit up, but immediately fell back against the pillow. "Crispin," Peregrine whispered, his voice hoarse from coughing. "Where were you? I was scared." "I'm here now," Crispin replied, sitting on the edge of the bed and placing his hand on his brother's burning forehead. "How are you feeling?" "Cold," Peregrine said, though sweat was beading on his temples. "And my chest hurts when I breathe." Ophelia appeared in the doorway, holding a glass of water and looking more worried than Crispin had ever seen her. She was 43 years old, had been working with refugee families for a decade, and had developed the kind of professional compassion that allowed her to care deeply without burning out completely. But something about the Ashworth brothers had gotten under her professional armor. "The NHS emergency queue is backed up for hours," she said quietly, speaking to Crispin as if he were an adult rather than a 16-year-old boy. "We can wait until morning and try to get him seen by a GP, or we can take him to A&E now and hope they can fit him in." "What do you think we should do?" Crispin asked, hearing the desperation in his own voice. "Honestly, I think he needs to be seen tonight, but I also know that means a long wait in a crowded emergency room, and that's not always the best environment for a sick child." Crispin looked down at his brother, who was listening to their conversation with the kind of adult understanding that broke his heart. Peregrine had never had the luxury of being a normal 8-year-old. The journey that had brought them to Manchester had forced him to grow up faster than any child should have to. "We'll go to the hospital," Crispin decided, "even if we have to wait all night." As they prepared to leave, gathering the few belongings that constituted their medical records, insurance documentation, and identification, Peregrine noticed the boxing gloves that Crispin had set down on their shared dresser. "What are those?" he asked, his fever-bright eyes focusing on the red leather with interest. "Someone gave them to me today," Crispin replied, not wanting to explain the full story while his brother was sick. "They're supposed to be special. They look important," Peregrine observed, with the perceptiveness that 8-year-olds sometimes displayed about things that mattered to the adults around them. "Maybe they are," Crispin said, tucking the gloves into his jacket pocket. "Maybe they'll bring us some luck." The taxi ride to Manchester Royal Infirmary took 20 minutes through empty streets. Peregrine dozed fitfully against Crispin's shoulder, while Ophelia made phone calls to colleagues, trying to expedite their case through the system. The hospital's emergency department was exactly as crowded as she had predicted. Dozens of people sitting in plastic chairs, some bleeding, some coughing, all waiting for their turn to be seen by overworked medical staff. As they settled in for what would clearly be a long wait, Crispin felt the weight of Tyson's gloves in his pocket and tried to remember what hope felt like. 12 hours ago, he had thought that maybe, just maybe, someone believed in him enough to help him build something better than mere survival. Now, watching his brother fight a fever in a crowded emergency room, while their social worker filled out forms that would determine whether they were worthy of treatment, Crispin wondered if champions were just another luxury that people like him couldn't afford. Outside, the rain continued to fall on Manchester, washing the streets clean but doing nothing to wash away the feeling that some problems were too big for any one person to solve, no matter how famous or well-intentioned they might be. But in his pocket, Tyson Fury's boxing gloves remained warm against his fingers, carrying with them the memory of someone who had seen him as worthy of respect, if only for a few precious minutes. Dawn was breaking over Manchester Royal Infirmary when the doctor finally called Peregrine's name. After 6 hours in the emergency waiting room, the little boy's fever had broken, and the chest x-rays showed no signs of pneumonia. The relief Crispin felt was so overwhelming that he had to excuse himself to the bathroom to cry in private, where no one could see him fall apart. By the time they returned to the hostel, it was nearly 8 a.m., and Crispin was operating on no sleep and the kind of emotional exhaustion that comes from carrying too much responsibility for too long. Ophelia had arranged for Peregrine to stay home from school, and the little boy was finally sleeping peacefully in their shared bed, his breathing steady and unlabored. Crispin knew he should try to sleep as well, but his mind was racing with practical concerns. The emergency room visit would generate bills that their limited benefits wouldn't cover. The hostel's manager had already made it clear that families who brought medical drama to the facility weren't welcome for extended stays. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Barnaby Thornfield's ultimatum echoed, "I want you and your little brother out of this neighborhood by tomorrow morning." It was this last thought that drove Crispin back out into the Manchester streets at midday, Tyson's boxing gloves tucked inside his jacket. He wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish by returning to the gym, but he knew he couldn't leave things as they were. The gloves had been given to him with intention, with meaning, and he owed it to both Tyson and himself to make one final attempt to claim the space he had been offered. Thornfield Boxing Gym looked different in the afternoon light. Less intimidating, perhaps, but also more worn around the edges. The building was a converted warehouse from the 1960s, all brick and industrial windows, situated between a launderette and a betting shop on a street that had seen better decades. Crispin stood outside for several minutes, working up the courage to go inside. Through the windows, he could see the familiar shapes of heavy bags, speed bags, and the ring where local fighters trained for weekend matches that drew small crowds of family and friends. When he finally pushed through the front door, the first person he saw was Lysander Pembroke. The 18-year-old was sitting alone on a bench near the changing rooms, still wearing the same clothes from the day before. His expensive trainers were scuffed, his usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and his eyes were red-rimmed in a way that suggested he had been crying. For a moment, both boys froze, unsure how to navigate this unexpected encounter. Yesterday, Lysander had been the aggressor, the one with power and privilege and righteous anger. Today, he looked like someone who had spent the night confronting uncomfortable truths about himself. "Crispin," Lysander said quietly, his voice hoarse. I didn't expect to see you here. I came to return these," Crispin replied, pulling Tyson's gloves from his jacket and holding them up. Mr. Thornfield made it clear I'm not welcome here, so I thought I should give them back to someone who could get them to Mr. Fury. Lysander stared at the gloves for a long moment, then looked up at Crispin's face. You're giving them back? What choice do I have? Crispin asked, though there was no bitterness in his voice, only resignation. I can't use them if I'm not allowed to be here. Sit down, Lysander said suddenly. Please, I need to tell you something. Crispin hesitated, still wary of the young man who had beaten him up less than 24 hours earlier. But something in Lysander's demeanor had changed fundamentally. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. I know you have no reason to trust me, Lysander continued, when Crispin remained standing. But I need you to know that what I did yesterday, it wasn't really about you. It felt like it was about me, Crispin replied. I know, and that's what makes it so terrible. Lysander's voice cracked slightly. You want to know why I really attacked you? Why I called you those things? Crispin waited, sensing that whatever was coming would be important. My sister Emily, Lysander said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She was 8 years old, same age as your brother. The present tense wasn't lost on Crispin. She died 18 months ago, in the Manchester Arena bombing. Lysander's composure finally cracked completely, and tears began streaming down his face. She was at a concert with my mum. They were supposed to be home by 10 o'clock. The words hit Crispin like a physical blow. He sank onto the bench beside Lysander, the boxing gloves forgotten in his lap. When I saw you, Lysander continued through his tears, when I heard you were from Syria, all I could think about was Emily lying in that hospital bed, asking me why someone had hurt her. And I know it doesn't make sense. I know you had nothing to do with what happened to her, but the pain it made me want to hurt someone the way I was hurting. The gym fell silent around them, except for the sound of Lysander's quiet sobs. Crispin found himself in the surreal position of wanting to comfort the person who had assaulted him the day before. I'm sorry about your sister, Crispin said finally. I can't imagine how much that must hurt. She would have hated what I did to you, Lysander replied. Emily always stood up for kids who were being picked on. She would have been ashamed of me. They sat in silence for several minutes, two young men connected by loss and pain in ways they were only beginning to understand. Finally, Lysander wiped his eyes and looked directly at Crispin. I want to make this right, he said. I don't know how, but I want to try. Before Crispin could respond, the gym's front door opened and Barnaby Thornfield walked in, followed by two other men who looked like local business owners. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they saw the two boys sitting together. What's he doing here? Barnaby demanded, pointing at Crispin. I thought I made myself clear yesterday. Lysander stood up, his posture straightening with new resolve. Actually, Mr. Thornfield, I'm glad you're here. There's something I need to discuss with you. I'm not interested in whatever teenage drama you two have sorted out, Barnaby replied dismissively. The boy needs to leave, and that's final. The boy's name is Crispin, Lysander said firmly. And before you make any final decisions, you might want to know about some interesting financial records I've discovered. Barnaby's expression changed immediately. What are you talking about? My father sits on the board of Manchester Youth Services, Lysander replied, his voice taking on the confidence that came from having real leverage. Last night I asked him to review the grant applications and funding reports for this gym. Turns out there are some significant discrepancies between what you've reported spending on youth programs and what you've actually spent. The color drained from Barnaby's face. I don't know what you think you've found, but £30,000 in donations, specifically earmarked for equipment and programs for disadvantaged children, Lysander continued relentlessly. Money that seems to have disappeared into general operating expenses, or possibly into your personal accounts. The two men with Barnaby exchanged uncomfortable glances and began edging toward the door. Clearly, they wanted no part of whatever was about to unfold. You can't prove anything, Barnaby said, but his voice lacked conviction. Actually, I can. My father's firm handles audits for several local charities. One phone call, and this place gets investigated by people who know exactly what to look for. Crispin watched this exchange with amazement, hardly able to believe that Lysander was using his family's influence to protect him rather than destroy him. What do you want? Barnaby asked, defeat evident in his posture. I want Crispin and his brother to be welcome here, Lysander replied. I want them treated with respect, and I want to start a program for refugee children who need somewhere safe to train and learn. A program? Funded by my family's foundation, Lysander said, clearly having thought this through carefully. Supervised by qualified instructors, open to any child who needs it, regardless of where they come from. Barnaby looked between the two boys, clearly calculating his options. The threat of a financial audit would destroy not just his business but his reputation in the community. The offer of legitimate funding for youth programs would actually solve several of his ongoing budget problems. And if I agree to this, then the financial irregularities remain between us, Lysander replied. A mistake that won't be repeated, rather than deliberate fraud that needs to be prosecuted. Crispin felt like he was watching someone else's life unfold in front of him. 24 hours ago, he had been alone, unwanted, facing homelessness with a sick brother and no allies. Now, somehow, his former attacker had become his advocate. Fine, Barnaby said finally, but I want all of this properly documented. Legal contracts, clear boundaries, no more surprises. Agreed, Lysander said, extending his hand to shake on the deal. As Barnaby stalked off to his office, muttering about paperwork and insurance liability, Lysander turned back to Crispin with a tentative smile. So, he said, want to teach me how to use those gloves properly? I have a feeling I'm going to need to learn how to fight for the right reasons. Crispin looked down at Tyson's gloves, then back up at this unexpected ally who had just transformed his life through sheer force of will and strategic thinking. I think, Crispin said slowly, that's exactly what these gloves are for, fighting for the right reasons. That evening, as Peregrine slept peacefully in their hostel bed, and Crispin cleaned and oiled Tyson's boxing gloves, he thought about the strange turns that life could take. He thought about his mother, who had taught him that strength came not from hitting back, but from choosing when and how to stand up for what mattered. He thought about Lysander, who had learned that the pain of loss could either destroy you or teach you to protect others from experiencing the same pain. And he thought about Tyson Fury, who had given him gloves that carried more than just the memory of victories. They carried the possibility of redemption, second chances, and the kind of unlikely friendships that could change everything. Tomorrow, he would return to the gym not as an unwelcome intruder, but as someone who belonged there. He would begin training not just his body, but his spirit, learning to channel his own pain into something that could help other lost children find their way home. The gloves had found their purpose, and so had he.